Hi, and welcome to my first ever horror chat. And I'm delighted that it is with Hailey Piper. Welcome, Hailey.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming along. And so I'm going to read a little bit from your bio on your website, and then we'll get into some questions and have a little plot twist questions later on and things like that. So, Hailey Piper is the Bram Stoker award winning author of Queen of Teeth. This beautiful book that I just got this week. I'm reading through it, and man, it's a corker. So you also have written No Gods for Drowning, The Worm and His Kings series, which I'm really eager to read. Your Mind is a Terrible Thing, Unfortunate Elements of My Anatomy, Benny Rose, The Cannibal King, and The Possession of Natalie Glasgow. She is an active member of the Horror Writers Association with articles and stories appearing in Tor Nightfire, Crime Reads, Library Journal, Pseudopod, Vesterian, Cast of Wonders, Daily Science Fiction, Dark Matter Magazine, Planet Scum, Cosmic Horror Monthly, and various other publications. She lives with her wife in Maryland, where their two occult rituals are where occult rituals are secret. So, and you can find Hailey Piper at haileypiper.com, and on Twitter as Hailey Piper Says, and Instagram, TikTok, and Tumblr is Hailey Piper Fights. Outstanding. So, Hailey, I'm a lifelong fan of horror, and I've recently started dipping into horror writing myself. But you are
Wonderful.
you're a seasoned pro. You're Bram Stoker Award. We got a lot to dig into here, but I would love to know first, like, when did you know or at least suspect that you wanted to write horror?
Um, I knew I wanted to write for a while. I was writing as a kid, just little stories and things. But I think the point where I really knew I wanted to write was after reading Stephen King's It. The cosmicness and the scope of the climax of that book. I remember reading the last like 200 or 300 pages up into like 2 in the morning when I was a kid finishing it. And I just like that was the point where I was like, I didn't know books. One, I didn't know books could do that. And two, I wanted to create things that made people feel the way this made me feel.
I love that, and especially that book, because exactly
Yeah.
that last section, and you're like, what?
And I think, but the funny thing is, after that, I what I thought I was going to be doing was fantasy. Um, but every time I tried to write fantasy, it just kept turning into horror. And
Awesome.
it wasn't until I was an adult that I was like thinking back, it's like always loved monsters, always loved horror movies. All the books I used to read were horror, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just like I should try writing horror on purpose.
Sounds like it. So that's great. So you mentioned Stephen King, but who are your other influences in horror? It could be books or film or other writers, just generally.
Um, when I was younger, definitely like Neil Gaiman and in movies like Hellraiser was like a big eye opener for me. I didn't read the book, The Hellbound Heart, until last year. Um, so more recently, in my adult life, like Ramsey Campbell, Sarah Tantlinger, Stephen Graham Jones have
Yeah.
been bigger influences.
Well, now you're influencing the next generation and the rest of us combined. So I'm glad you're out here. Like, I'll get into reading this in a bit, but I just love that you're just like you just go for it straight from page one, and I powerfully admire that, because I think that if you're not a slow burn person, I don't think you're just like, we're in it. Here we go.
I admire slow burn writing and I do enjoy it myself, but I it's just not where my head is at most of the time when I'm writing stuff. Um, and also because like I'm a big fan of like the middle book twist,
Oh
and
yeah,
that's not a very popular thing. Most people like an end twist, but I like a middle book twist because it's almost like you're getting two different kinds of stories within the same set of characters and world and such. So there's no reason for it to not just get right started with one horror story if you know things are going to take a turn later and be something a little different. Um, then that's just how I see things. But
excellent.
it's an exciting thing for me to just be like, yeah, let's turn everything on its head in the middle of the book.
I love that. And that's something that I like to do too. So it's kind of fun to talk to somebody else who does that as well. Like,
It's not common,
it isn't.
at least that I found.
Yeah.
And I totally understand why the end twist is, it leaves people with something like kind of their jaws gaping at the end. But I like stuff where it keeps exploring. So that's cool to hear that you do that
Yeah.
too.
It's fun because, you're going along and like there's an expectation, like you said, that if there's anything that's crazy is going to happen later. But when you have that dynamic split and suddenly you're in a whole new universe and you're like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't know what to expect now. Uh-oh, and I love that subversion. I love yanking that out.
Yeah. And some people aren't ready for it. They're like, oh, why did this change? I was expecting the second act of the book to be the same exact thing through like the middle 200 pages. But some people are really up for it. They're really into it. They're like, oh my God, that just ambushed me. And now I can't wait to see what's going to happen next.
Yeah, I think that there's a propulsion from that, right? Like suddenly, you're not going to bog down in the middle. There is no
Right,
foggy
right.
middle. It
I
is
hate that. That's the worst thing.
a peak middle, and you're going to climb it. Excellent. So, how much, like your day is. Are you a full-time writer at this point?
No, just gotta pay the bills.
Yeah, yeah. I
But
heard.
my writing is usually morning. On weekends I can do more. Like on weekends I'll write from like when I get up to like noon or afternoon or something. Unless I'm not writing that day. And then weekdays it's like, from when I get up till when I have to start my day job.
Okay. So you have the structure that you have to do a lot of time management in order to get this fiction side of things down, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point I'm so used to it that I don't really think about it that much. Like I'm used to just kind of like do the house stuff, do the bills, whatever around that. It seems to work out okay.
yeah, I think it's a good discipline way to go because I know a lot of people ask, how do you fit it together with a full-time job with all the other responsibilities you have?
Yeah, I mean it helps that I don't have kids. Um, but I don't I mean I hats off to parents who are writers because I honestly don't think I could do it.
It's not easy.
Yeah. Um, but like right the morning is when I'm at my sharpest. Like I used to try to cram writing in at the end of the day and it just didn't work for me because I was just so out of it and done. But morning, like I'm a morning person. I'm at it when I get up. So like often I won't sleep as late as I could because my brain is already going bonkers. So I'll just get up, get to it. Um
That's excellent.
yeah.
Yeah, if I have to kind of push mine late, but I'm a morning person, so that's hard for me, like
Mhm.
schedule thing and like with kids and with different, as they get older and their schedules are different, then you're like, oh, now I have to reinvent. But it's
Right.
helpful to know that you start your day like writing before the rest of it. I think that's valuable. And I think that's maybe less common. So it's really cool.
I think the best thing is I don't think there's a single best thing. I think the best thing a writer can do is try to play to their inherent strengths
Yes.
as far as that goes. So if you like, and that's kind of like there's the whole like write every day thing. I don't write every day. I write most days, but I don't write every day, even though I have time to, I usually have time to write each day. That doesn't mean I do because I don't think that's necessarily conducive to good writing.
I agree with
I think that if you're forcing it, then
it's not
it's
the same.
not going to go as well.
No.
No.
And I also I don't really believe in a muse situation. Like I do think that we write when we're on. There's no real muse per se, but the ritual of the writing is its own thing, its own entity
Yeah.
in a lot of ways.
I
But
mean, and habit too helps a lot. Like consistency
yeah,
makes you get used to it. And like I don't
muscle that you're exercising, in a way.
right. And that's one of those other things like when like the muse thing that you brought that up. Like people will be like, well, I have to wait, like you should wait till you're inspired. And like I don't agree with that at all. Inspired, when I'm inspired, I take notes.
Yeah.
When I sit down to
Yes.
write, it's time to write. And that'll be based off of those notes, maybe.
Mhm.
But a lot of that stuff just goes in a file somewhere on my computer. I think John Langan likened it to like somebody coming up in an elevator to your brain and delivering something to you, and you just got to be ready to put it down,
Yeah,
and
that's
save
right.
it for when you're ready to use it.
I love that.
But
That's
it's like if you wait till you're inspired, you might be inspired while you're like at work. Like, what are you supposed to do then? Like,
yeah.
you might be
Well,
inspired and you just get frustrated, but it's just like you can take a note. You don't have
right.
to write a chapter. You can write the
Exactly.
chapter later.
Yeah. That's kind of how I do it too. Like I have my notes app, and I'm sometimes I even if if I'm traveling, I'm like dictate it, and they're like, okay, I'll deal with this,
Yeah.
get it down.
Whatever gets it down.
Yeah, that's the whole point, right? Because if it's not down, you can't work with it. So
Right. And I think that's a pressure that writers also put on themselves. It's like, I have to get this perfect. And it's like, no, my notes are barely even coherent words. Like they're half sentences sometimes. Like it's just
that's just a word.
and a zero draft of a book may just be that messy crap piled together in chronological order of when it's going to happen in the book and not be something you could satisfyingly read. That's for later. That's not right now's problem.
Right. Fix it in post is the same.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree, because I feel like I'm going to get that zero draft down. If I don't, there's a problem. But
Right,
you can work toward that goal. And I think like we set ourselves up for guilt trips and failure if we think, oh, I've got to do it this way every day, all the time. No,
right,
it's a kind of a punishment in a way. It's not a
right,
carrot at the end of that stick, except your own burnout, which is not a very good carrot.
right. No. And I think that's one of the things that like if you're getting started and you don't haven't figured your stuff out yet, when you hear a writer giving advice, don't take that as like that is the advice to follow. No, he listened to a bunch of different writers
Yep.
and pick out the pieces that will make up your routine because like, oh, that works for me and try different things and stuff. Like you got to find what works for you. No single person's way of doing things is going to be like exactly the same for some other person's way of doing things.
Absolutely. I do a lot of these chats, and this is my first horror one, but I do fantasy and science fiction. And every single one of you is different. There are
Yeah.
some through lines because you're all published, and so you've reached that point, right? But your paths there and your methods are also different, but they're also valuable, and everybody can benefit from learning and experimenting, as you say, because I do believe in listening to a lot of different voices. I think that is something that helps us grow.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, and then in that too, like I get inspired by all of you. Like you get me excited talking about your own process, because then my wheels are turning. I think it's a giving cycle, right? That we get
Yeah, totally.
inspired by our communities.
Yes, and that's one of the values of writing communities. Like you can give, you can understand, it all circulates. And like you said, this is being your first horror one, but it's science fiction, fantasy, thriller, romance. Um, it's not like I believe in reading broadly. I think regardless of which genre you're most proficient in or you mostly focus on, it's important to you know figure out what everybody's doing and like cross pollinate and such. But that also goes for the authors themselves. Like the different approaches
yeah,
benefit each other.
right. Speaking of that, this is a good segue into something I really wanted to dig into that I had discovered. I self-published the Questers Saga, which is a space opera, but there are horror elements in it, from Heliopause. And that's because my love of sci-fi horror is kind of like a subgenre. But I noticed early on that the horror writing community is exceptional in a way, and I'm not shading any other form of community. I'm just saying the horror community is amazing to me. It is highly accepting, diverse, energetic, kinetic, intermobile, and encouraging of new voices. And I think that is one great draw. And it's not the only draw. It's not the only reason. I write spooky stuff. Like the Shadow Galaxy's got some true horror in it, in addition to the other genres. But I really, in some ways, wanted to write horror because I wanted to be part of the horror community because it's stellar. Can you speak to that? What do you think?
Um, I think I mean, I agree with you. I think that the horror community is very accepting because horror is so maligned. If you
Yes.
like, uh, it's the kind of like the shame of the genres as far as a lot of people are concerned. That and romance.
which is
Um,
ridiculous to me because it
it
is
is.
still speculative fiction, you know.
Right. But it's because it's, you know, gross, because it's bloody sometimes, because it is dealing with discomfort, which a lot of people
Yeah,
don't care for.
right.
Um, I mean, we're having a discussion on Twitter, which is, you know, of course, where intelligent conversation can go to die, but sometimes you can find mushrooms of it there.
True.
Um, and about, you know, acceptability thresholds within fiction, that there are restrictions in some genres, and horror doesn't have that. Horror doesn't have rules. It just is. And so when you have situations where there are definitely authors with certain voices who haven't been able to maybe express themselves as much in other genres, they're finding the ability to do so in horror because the discomfort is part of the point. The honesty is part of the point. And because of that stuff, catharsis becomes part of the point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And from that, you know, what do you think when you're writing horror, when you're in that space of discomfort and unsettling feelings, and you know, what is your draw to that, and how does that speak to you? Why does it inspire you in that way?
I think it just goes back to the honesty of it. I think that is more reflective of how I feel about things, how I feel about the world. I think when something's too nice, it doesn't feel honest.
Mm, yeah.
Because I never, you don't, I don't see them really. And what I, one of the things I cherish about real life is because there is all this bad stuff going on, and within that you can find kindness.
Yes.
Um, and I think horror is closer to that than this presentation of everything is perfect,
Right.
that you sometimes are encouraged to do. Is like, can this be nicer? Can this be gentler? It's just like, I find more in like, I tell people this, to A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 is one of my comfort movies.
Awesome.
And that's a movie where characters you like are killed horribly, and there's like, and like they're, but it speaks to me because when the kids are trying to explain what's going on, the adults largely aren't listening, and that speaks
Interesting.
more to what I understand of the world.
Yeah.
Um, when and they are rallying together, they are committed to helping each other, even when they're not agreeing with each other, and they're up against something that is horrifying and insidious, and like, and even though they don't completely win in each situation, to me that's a comfort movie because it speaks to something that I feel seen with that movie.
Yeah.
That's just an example, but like I think that's what it is. Like, that discomfort makes me feel seen, which ends up making me feel more comfortable.
Yeah. I can see that. It makes sense. So like, you know, your how the magic, of course, it's hard to describe how we create the magic of what we write, and but in that space, you know, when you are on and you're writing, how do you get across that feeling of discomfort in your words? You know, is there, you know,
Hmm.
where do you have to be, you know, in your thoughts, you know, like what
That
feeling?
depends on the type of discomfort, I suppose.
Yes.
If it's a more like tangible or tactile, then I think about what those feelings are. I mean, one of the neat things with writing, with reading, is that you know, movies can present you sight and sound, but you can get scent, you can get taste, you can get feeling with reading.
True.
And so I, you know, when I'm writing, I'm not like, if I'm third person, I'm not in like this omniscient, I'm separated from the characters,
Yeah.
watching down all godlike state. I'm inside of whoever the perspective
Yes.
character is,
Mm.
and I'm feeling what they're feeling. And yeah, I mean, so for that kind of discomfort, you know, I just think about being in the scenario, being in the situation. For more like emotional stuff, I think it's just kind of drawing up on experiences,
Yeah.
drawing up on memories, on situations I've been in, things like that. And they don't have to be one to one with what's going on in the story. In fact, I think that could be kind of reductive after a while. Um, but just kind of the feeling still being prominent, and then using that in writing.
Excellent.
Working off of that, because again, with the honesty, you want it to be genuine. And it's not like that's necessarily going to scare everybody who reads it, especially if they can't click with that same
Right.
situation that you're writing. But hopefully the human experience of it can get across.
And I think that speaks to the fact that, horror writers have to have a sense of empathy. You have to put yourself in the position of, either being, the victim or the attacker, right? Which is very interesting. It is a messy type of genre without
Right.
these constrictions, but at the same time, that works because, empathy is messy. It is
Right.
amorphous. And
And it creates a lot of gray space
exactly,
morally.
and that's a good place to navigate for stuff. So you, what, when you're writing horror and you write long versus short fiction, because you do both, yes, and
Yeah.
what do you think? What do you think the difference is in your mindset when you're approaching, say, short fiction versus long fiction and horror?
My, I'm not sure, honestly, and I've been asked this question before, and you'd think I'd have a good answer by now.
The hard one.
Um, but because a lot of my stuff, I approach it with the sense of this is going to be a short story. So what ends up happening when that isn't, when it's not a short story, it's because I failed. It's because I failed to have it be a short story. It grew too large, or I found too many elements of it to look at, or right. It became a bigger thing,
Yeah,
not because I sat down like, I'm going to write a big thing. It's because
default.
the idea is something that got out of control. If it's something that the reason I have so many short stories is because, if it can be a short story, then it is a short story.
Yeah,
Because I think we've all been there where we've read a book that we were like, this could have been a short story. And
yeah.
I don't want to do that. I don't want any of my books to be something that you could read and be like, ah, that could have been a short story. I want that to be impossible for my books. So first attempt tends to be a short story. Queen of Teeth, for example. There's a story in, oh, shoot, uh, Lost Contact, anthology Lost Contact from Perpetual Motion Press Publishing, or Perpetual Motion Machine Publishing.
Okay.
That is what I wrote before Queen of Teeth. That was kind of the trial run. It's like, is this a viable world? Is this a viable kind of premise? After I wrote that, I started Queen of Teeth immediately after, because I was like, okay, there's too much more here to explore than
Yeah,
just that story. Benny Rose, that was also, I wrote that as 3 different short stories, just trying to get it before I realized finally, like, this needs to be a book. Like, it's none of these stories are getting across what I want by themselves. It's too restrictive.
yeah.
Um, Whereas, let's see, I can't remember the name of the story. But um, it was in a Conjuring for All Seasons, and ended up being a novelette. But as I was writing it, I thought it was going to be a book. Like, it was getting out of control, and I thought it was going to be turned into a book. But then a lot of the other elements that I tried to explore, the other pathways, kind of crumbled apart, and I realized, like, no, this is a story. It's good as a story.
Yeah.
So I don't know if the reason I don't have a good answer to your question is because I don't really sit down and separate them in the first place. It's really just a matter of, does it get out of control from being short fiction?
That makes sense to me because I write both long and short. And I know there does come a point where, like, do you want to slam the door here, or is the door still open? And you see something walking down the hall, and oh my God, you want to follow it, so
Right.
kind of how it works for me. But I know about losing that, getting it out of control. So it's a lot of fun, though. It can be
Oh,
fun.
it is.
Like, if you have a short story in mind and suddenly whoops, this should be a novel. And I've come at it both ways, right? Like, I've come at it like where I thought, hey, this could be a book, but then I start writing and I'm like, no, actually, this is a nice little
Yep.
unit. And that's cool.
Yeah. No, it is. And it makes, and the other way where it does get out of control, it makes you more excited to keep going
Yes.
because there's all this stuff to play, and there's not that um there's not kind of this as much like resistance with it, I feel like,
Yeah,
as might be the case if you set out like this has to be a book. Okay, what do I fill it with? It's
I
like,
think that's important. Yeah,
yeah, it's like it's not that there's something to fill it with. You're trying to catch up with all the stuff you already been coming up with.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
You're galloping.
and
Yeah.
yeah.
No, you know, and I love that because I feel like that's really good advice for writers starting out. It's like you don't have to just write books. You don't have to just write
Right.
short stories. You can do any mix of this. And I love that we seem to be in a I can't even speak renaissance of short fiction right now, which
Yeah.
is dear to my soul because of Ray Bradbury, Stephen King,
Oh, totally. There are so many really deeply special short stories. And it's just
on
and
those.
and yeah, and it's just like I did a virtual panel for StokerCon about short fiction, and that's obviously not broadcast yet, but like one of the things they said is like the reason short stories are so important is that's how we start off with telling stories. Like you don't sit around a campfire and start going like, okay, here's an entire novel. Like
Right, right.
you tell a ghost story.
Yeah, perfect. That's perfect. So let's talk about your current books. I'm I will be finishing this and leaving a review because I love to leave reviews because I know
Well,
how
thank you.
important. And I love this book and the premise of it. Not a small coincidence that I have a biotech background, so there's a little bit of that action. Um,
I didn't
but
know that.
yeah, so I would love to know what you're currently working, what's coming, what's just come out. Tell us what's going on in your books and short stories.
Sure. Short stories gets harder because there are a lot of them. But this month,
Good problem.
yeah. This month, I'm trying to like juice my brain for like what's going to be coming this month. Let's see. Trying to get the order down. So there's I think actually this coming week there's going to be We're Here, an LGBTQI plus anthology of horror is
Awesome.
going to be coming out. It's a charity anthology. All the
Ooh.
profits go to the Trevor Project.
Oh, great.
And in that is a novelette, She Tasted of Good Fortune, which takes place in the horror noir dark fantasy world of my book No Gods for Drowning.
Oh,
So it's gonna be a whole novelette, like so like 10,000 word story. So it's gonna be a big like return to that world for people who've already read that big book, or maybe it'll be somebody's primer to be like, oh, I really like that story. Might want to check out more.
fantastic.
Let's see. I've got my I'm not going to pronounce this right. Le Petit Morts.
Yeah.
Is an anthology of erotic horror dark fairy tales.
Ooh, love
Um,
dark fairy tale.
it's yeah, so it's stories based off off fairy tales and myth that are erotic horror.
Ooh,
And my story opens the book with an erotic Sphinx story, Riddle to the Death.
oh, that sounds
Um,
incredible.
and at the end of the month, Crystal Lake Horror will be releasing their third volume of Unspeakable Horror, which is all LGBTQ horror stories. And I will have a McCarthy era story because I don't think a lot of people are aware of the lavender scare from that time period,
Yeah,
called Bad with Secrets.
that sounds amazing. Really
So
cool.
those are recent short stories coming out. And then books, the second Worminus Kings book just came out in April, Even the Worm Will Turn, which comes back to that cosmic horror story. Um, Next month, July 25th, I have my splatter Western from Death's Head Press, Cruel Angels Past Sundown,
Ooh,
which is about a woman and her husband. They run a ranch, and at evening, a naked pregnant woman wielding a cavalry saber shows up at their place, and it sets her running from a cannibal demon and a mad preacher to get to a nearby town where she holds up with other people she knows as this horrible night ensues.
oh my God, it's incredible.
And then
Excited?
in October, sorry, I've got 3 books out this year.
Yes.
And then in October, I have A Light Most Hateful coming from Titan Books.
I'm so stoked about this. I can't wait.
Um,
Tell us
and
about
that's a small town survival horror book novel about runaway who's been living in this like nowhere town in Pennsylvania for 3 years. And this summer storm hits that unleashes first a monster and then puts most of the people in town into this violent trance.
Ooh,
And it's her trying to find her loved ones and escape town before this storm, like,
God,
ravages reality, essentially.
incredible stuff. And I could see why Tom
Mm.
publishing that one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been very cool working with them.
I mean, this is an incredible slate, and I'm very excited and thrilled for you. So, but I'm noticing some interesting things, and you talked a little bit about it, and I wondered what are the subgenres of horror you really like to play in or consume the most? Because I'm hearing cosmic horror come up a lot.
Right.
I love
And I
personally
try
love.
to do different things. Like Cosmic Horror is coming up multiple times because it's a trilogy. The Worm and His Kings, Even the Worm Will Turn, and then the third book will come out next year. Um, I kind of like working in everything though.
Yeah, that's great.
Like I've got a crime horror, kind of supernatural crime novella coming out early next year from Bad Hand Books, Cranberry Cove.
Ooh,
But then if you look at the backlist, Queen of Teeth is body horror. Benny Rose is like a slasher and coming of age story. Your Mind's Terrible Thing is space horror. But I guess if you look across them, I do go to body horror a lot.
hmm,
Um, and I don't, there's no way to say like a favorite. Like Cosmic Horror has been it for a while. More of my short stories get into Cosmic Horror, I think, than my books necessarily. Um, and that's just fun because I like the wonder of it.
yeah,
Like I know classically, like if you go back to like Lovecraft, cosmic horror is supposed to be like, oh, you feel like you're nothing and tiny and whatever, and you don't matter and such, and this existential stuff. But for me, I love cosmic horror because there's such a wealth of imagination in it, and like I enjoy like looking at like science stuff about how big the universe is and how wild like star systems and all that stuff is, all the amazing things that happen in our galaxy, let alone our
yep,
universe. And like cosmic horror starts to dip into that same level, but it's stuff that's not real. And I just love getting into that scope of time and space and like and the scale of these big things. Like it was like, oh, we don't matter. It's like, well, we don't matter to the sun either, and you're not afraid of that usually.
good
So I just like the wonder of it.
point.
And then body horror is the complete opposite. Like cosmic horror is zooming out a lot. Body horror is zooming in
Yeah,
like as much as you can get. And I enjoy the visceralness. I enjoy exploring what can go on with people's bodies, what's impossible with people's bodies. And also just kind of again, one of the ideas of body horror sometimes is just like all the horror of it, but I kind of like the idea of the horror of it then giving way to acceptance of it and then
yeah,
potential.
yeah. That's a really good point. And that's another reason I do like horror is because of that sort of potential of self-acceptance.
Yeah, that's one of the neat things because there's obviously the surface of just it being scary, it being upsetting, it being discomforting. But horror also, because it's so messy, like you said earlier, also lets you explore like, hey, this fucked up thing. What if I'm okay with this?
Right. Right. Maybe it's a form of evolution, in a way.
Or maybe you just like it more than like your regular life, like
Right.
or the character does or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and then, kind of thinking along those lines. And so here's a little bit of a curveball. Like, do you identify with the monsters sometimes more than their prey, so to speak?
I think that really depends on the writer. I think that really depends on how they are tending to what they're working on. um it's fine. I think it all just keeps going back to Frankenstein, which is really the birth of horror as a genre.
Right.
um you know we have this, I think, on a simple surface level, you have this sense of like, uh Victor Frankenstein's monster is the monster. But and it takes giving that a moment's thought or even just reading the source to note that it's just like, no, the monster is the victim here in a lot of ways, more ways than than Victor Frankenstein is.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings up one of my favorite movie quotes. Burke, I don't know which species is worse, from Aliens. So
Yeah, oh yeah, totally.
I think that's kind of a fun playground to be in. I mean, if you had to pick a monster to be, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. It's a hard one. Off the top of my head, I don't know. But I do like you brought up the xenomorphs though, because as far as they're concerned, they're not doing anything wrong. They're just animals.
They're just
They're just doing what they do.
my space, yo. What do you
Right. And that's one of the funny things. Like it's like the shark infested waters thing.
right?
It's like the waters aren't infested with sharks. That's where they live. The
Yeah,
beach is human infested waters.
I know. Oh, and that it brings up. I talked about this because I do like this ecology and world building, and it includes horror, and I include because my degree's in ecology that the food web
Mm,
dynamic of horror is one is the predator, one is the prey. Often it's an interaction on that level, and it
right.
could be not necessarily separate entities. It could be inside of you. Like part of you is
Right.
predator, part is prey, part is the dynamic of control and do you
I think that's what Queen of Teeth is.
yeah, I mean, I'm already that's survival. I was like, this is just I love this kind of stuff. So in that regard, like, this is kind of when I do the sci-fi author chats, I always have this curveball question of like it's like Voight Kampf from Blade Runner, what would tip you off to being human or replicant? In this case, what would tip people off to your being human versus a monster? Let's start with human first. What makes you totally human? Like that's Hailey, that's totally you.
I mean, I have to kind of like worm around that question though, without completely answering it directly, because I think what a lot of people view as human is kept in the grounds of what they consider to be like normal,
Clever.
not necessarily what actually is your humanity.
Yes, that is
Whereas what actually is core to your humanity can be monstrous to some people,
very true.
because it deviates from what they accept as normal. And
Yep.
I think that's core to what horror gets at too.
Excellent. Excellent point.
But as far as like if you want to put it on a more like, kind of standard level, like, as like for example of vampires, like I'm not sure people would because I don't leave my house very much.
That's great.
I could be fooling everybody.
Could be what can't disprove, right? So we don't know that that's sunlight coming into your room,
Right, exactly. I
fake
mean, it
light,
is, but you don't know.
it's
Well,
filtered.
it's also the lamp. This is a dark room, so
I love that. I mean, let's just talk about that for a second. Like, what are your favorite, like, let's say, just say top three favorite horror movies? That's a hard one because
that's a hard one too. Why are you asking all these hard questions?
oh, I love to dig in. I love it.
I don't know, honestly. Nightmare on Elm Street 3 is definitely one of them. Um, it's hard, like for example, I can always it's so easy. It almost feels like cheating to bring up John Carpenter's The Thing
That's my
because
all-time favorite movie, by the way.
it is one of the very best horror movies ever. It is a
It is
masterpiece.
a
So
master,
it's almost cheating to be like, oh, that's one of my favorites because
but
like, yeah,
for a reason,
everybody, like, of course it is. It's so good. How can you help but love it?
oh,
Um,
it's perfect, like
it's funny. The other funny thing is like, there's a lot of ones that aren't that great of movies if you're looking at them from some like movie standard,
no, I'm not.
but just the love is so big.
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in. I'm like, what do you love? Like, you love it. It's just so, yeah, gosh, you sent me back with Nightmare on Elm Street, and I just have so many treasured memories of those movies and with my friends growing up, at the same
See,
time.
I wish I had that because I didn't get to them until I was an adult. I was almost doing my own history of horror thing as a child. Like all I watched when I was little was like the old Universal horror movies, the black and
Oh,
white ones,
yeah.
and like stop motion, like
Oh,
Harryhausen
Harryhausen.
movies.
Love Harryhausen. Love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a lot of slow catch up. And I think the big curve was accidentally seeing Hellraiser when I was 13.
That's what I thought
And it's just like,
too. You're
oh,
like,
that's very different.
oh, oh.
But
Favorite
I
I
loved it, but I
thought.
still wasn't like doing slashes except like Scream because everybody, I was in middle school when Scream came out and everybody was watching Scream.
Right, right.
So that was like, that was slashers to me. Like we rented Friday 13th, the first three of those because I was like, I've heard, I grew up on Goosebumps or
Yeah.
books of that like nature up until I was like reading like Mike Crichton and Stephen King and Dean Koontz, but like um you'd have kid characters referencing Friday 13th as this like horrible thing. And I remember asking my mom, it's like, all these books, they keep mentioning Friday 13th is the scariest, is the bloodiest. It's like, can we rent it? And she's like, oh, sure, whatever. And I'm just like watching it. I'm just like, I don't know if it's just the jaded nature of a pre-adolescent, but I was just like, this is pretty tame. But Hellraiser was a different story though. Hellraiser was just like you're not if you're a kid, you're not prepared for
No,
Hellraiser. There's
you're
just no
not.
way.
No. Yep.
Like
Same.
it is operating on a not just the gore, but it is
Yes.
operating a completely different philosophical level from things that have come before or after it in large part.
When I remember like seeing that, and then like seeing Jacob's Ladder and Dead Ringer, kind of all in the same Dead Ringers, kind of all in the
Yeah.
same few years. How each of them kind of tripped up what I originally thought of as horror, and like got me thinking, oh well, this is quite. You can do something different, and then Event Horizon.
Mm,
It's a whole other aspect of it, which of course has that secret missing footage, which
right.
or not so secret. But I love that we had those spikes coming out of the other horror movies that are just like, oh my God, wait a minute, hold on. This
And I
is
think sometimes just not old enough to grasp how horrible what you're watching is sometimes.
there's that.
Like because there's one weekend when I was 9, I think we rented the original Night of the Living Dead, the 1970s Invasion of the Body
Which
Snatchers,
was freaky, man.
and uh Carnosaur. And
Artist store, oh my God.
yeah, and like so if you watch those three movies, you know that their endings are not exactly happy ones.
Right.
And I think as a kid, I was just numb in a way. Like I was just kind of like I watched without comment
Yeah.
and didn't completely absorb.
Yeah.
Um and like I think if I'd watched Hellraiser at that age, it would have been the same thing. But 13 was just the right time
Yep.
for Hellraiser to like dip inside me and rearrange my brain as yeah, so
Yeah, that's kind of fascinating that we kind of came across it about the same time.
yeah.
Lives,
I'm kind of completely dodged your question.
I mean, no, you didn't really. I mean, we're talking about movies that we love.
Yeah, it's hard. There's so many good ones. Like
Oh,
it baffles me when there are articles that are just like, how horror is just like a homicidal maniac in the woods, and I'm just like, how is your head this deep in the sand when there's so much
really?
incredible stuff? We have 100 years of amazing horror,
Mm.
and you're just going to be like, yeah, the only thing that exists is the maniac, which nobody's seen. Like, most people haven't seen outside of horror,
Right.
and they're just watering it all down to either Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees.
So
Which and the thing is, and not to slam on that either,
no
because
shame.
those have an inherent value in the genre, but that's not everything. It's not even close.
Right. Not even close. And I think that's a really good lesson for, listeners and viewers. It's just like there's a universe of horror.
Hmm.
There's something for everyone. And
Right. If there's something you like, there's a horror equivalent to it.
bingo, bingo. And then that's just I love that you're picking different facets to this dark jewel to write in. I love it.
I feel like they pick me. Um,
I think so. I think
because I didn't plan on like doing so much subgenre hopping. It just kind of came about.
yeah.
Um, because I would want to explore this and want to explore that. And
Right.
just, it just kept happening. And it's just like, okay, that's, I guess the Haley Piper thing is just hopping around doing different stuff.
Right. That's cool. But speaking of that, though, what's your dream horror writing project?
No. I think each time it's the next one, I
Yeah,
think.
that's
Like because Queen of Teeth was very much, I just cut loose. I said, anything goes. I'm not going to say no to myself for anything I want to do in this. And I'm just going to dump my personality all over it. And we honestly, I remember my wife and I talking about it, and we were both kind of just like, we'll be lucky if this finds a publisher. And then if it finds a publisher, it'll probably have a few readers, like whatever. There's no way we could have possibly conceived this vagina monster queer romance horror story was going to, be an award-winning book. There's
well,
just no way.
yeah, you broke the mold, you know. That's what's really exciting too, is that, horror being messy,
Hmm.
that exists can easily be broken. So,
Exactly.
but it comes from the passion to do that. So, which you're radiating constantly. So I love that. But like writers starting out, we touched on this a bit. What's the worst writing advice you've ever received? Just trash.
Oh my God. I bury this stuff so deep in it, like psychologically, that I'm just um like I keep some of the better writing advices like on hand because you never know when you're going to be asked something
True.
like that. Worst writing advice. Oh my. Um, I honestly can't remember. I'm trying to think of like a good one. Like I've seen some terrible ones like weather, don't describe what people look like. It's the most inane, weird stuff. Like you would like, why are you even telling people? Because the thing that really upsets me,
Yeah.
because you'll see lists of these things. And I remember like Neil Gaiman like verbally essentially rolling his eyes over one of these lists. And it's just like the the one of like the don't describe weather just drives me up the wall because I use weather so much for some of my stories, the atmosphere. Benny Rose and
Yeah.
Light Most Hateful, they're very dependent on the rain and storms in the story. The cold in Queen of Teeth, the again, the rain and no gods, maybe I'm using rain too much, maybe I got to mix it up for snow or something. The windstorm in Cruel Angels when that comes out, and it's just like it feels like a fingerprint of the author on the story. And I think sometimes that classically writing says don't do that, but it's like saying to a painter, don't leave your mark, don't sign your work, don't leave your
Yeah.
brush strokes.
It's world building.
Right. It's so like we react to it so viscerally in real life.
Have to.
The what is happening in the weather. How I get, depending on how the weather is, depends on whether I'm going to have a good day or not because of migraines and stuff.
Yep.
Um, so like maybe that's the, I don't know if that's the worst writing advice, but it's definitely one that drives me up the wall because I think it's so ridiculous. And the thing that breaks my heart is that newer writers, when they see lists like that, when they see advice like that, yeah, maybe most of them will be like, that doesn't sound quite right, or they'll just ignore it. But there's out of 100, there's might be one who takes it seriously, and it hurts their artistic potential for, it could be years before
Exactly.
they realize, hey, wait a second, that was bullshit.
Oh man. Yeah, exactly. And like I think it's so frustrating. That's one reason I like to ask this, is because I like for writers to hear, that there really is bad advice. You don't
Oh,
have to know all
totally.
this stuff. But on the flip side, there's also great advice. And so what would be the best writing advice you could give to someone starting out?
There are no bad ideas, only ones that you're not going to use yet. Um, if it pops in your head, jot it down, put it in your notes app, dictate it, jot it down in a notebook, put it in have a file on your computer where you're going to put things. You can organize them or don't, whatever suits you. But you know, don't say no to those things, because if you train your brain to reject ideas, eventually it's going to stop having them.
Yeah. Good advice. Very, very good advice. Well, Hailey, where can we find you online to round this up?
My website is www.haileypiper.com. I'm on Twitter at Hailey Piper Says, and on TikTok, Tumblr, and Instagram at Hailey Piper Fights.
Great. Well, Hailey, this has been magnificent. Thank you so much for being on Horror
Thank
Author
you so
Chat.
much for having me. This is wonderful.